it's Brod here, host of Felon True Crime, here with the very first AMA session for Felon. So thank you to the listeners who got in touch through Facebook, through Twitter, through Instagram. I'll do the best I can to answer those questions, and hopefully it'll give you a little bit of insight into the podcast and how I operate when I present the cases and stories. Okay, so to kick it off, we have a question from Maggie. And the question is, how do you set up the structuring of your show? Now, I guess the structure of the stories that I present can vary from case to case. And I guess the main thing that determines how I share those stories or how I structure those stories would be how I feel would be the best kind of engagement for the listener. And so if I feel there needs to be some sort of reveal that kind of occurs within the case, if there's some sort of twist that occurs, I kind of structure in a way that if I were a listener to this particular podcast, or any podcast for that matter, how would I like to hear a certain story unfold? And that's kind of where I kicked off with the very first episode. Basically, I read the book that was based around the murders of the Crawford family, and from the get-go we have a suspect that's insinuated, and it didn't really leave too much to the imagination. And I found in a lot of books that I have read, a lot of the facts are presented quite early, and it doesn't really unfold in a way that is too suspenseful or that allows a lot of intrigue. So I think from my point of view, when I structure a case or when I structure a story, I think about how it needs to unfold from a listener's perspective, and that kind of guides how I structure it. Now, it can vary from case to case. There are some cases that we, I guess in general, especially within Australia, know more about, and so that will affect how I present it if it's a well-known case. If it's a lesser-known case, then I guess there's a bit more scope as far as how it could be presented to the listener without revealing too much, because there may not be too much that's actually known. So I guess in summary to that question, I think the structure of the cases will vary, and I structure each case based on how I feel it needs to unfold to the listener. So next question we have from Bronwyn, and the question is, how do you stay impartial and report the facts? I guess from the get-go, when I set out to create the podcast, it wasn't something that I saw that I needed to inject too much of my own opinions, or I didn't feel I needed to be really blunt as far as how I presented, I guess, my viewpoint of different cases. So I feel that, first of all, the story needs to be told in a way that's engaging for the listener. But also, I think it does need to be based on facts. But I think the facts that are chosen to be shared within the presentations, I think in a lot of ways, that is some way that I can reflect my opinions fairly subtly without being too blatant and abrupt about it. And that's, I guess, from my point of view, I feel I should put those people who are affected by the cases, directly affected, or the victims in the cases, I feel from my role is to present them and their lives in the most positive way possible. And I think the perpetrators or the offenders, I think they need to be presented in the worst possible light. So I think in some ways I'm able to kind of select the facts to reflect that, but in a lot of ways my emotional opinions or my emotional reactions to different cases probably won't come through. I guess that's the impartial part, in a sense that I don't feel I need to inject myself into the story The story it's already there. There are the key players who have been involved, and so I just feel it's my job to let it unfold and let the listeners make up their opinion. And I think in a lot of ways that how the facts are presented, there's probably only really one way that anyone listening to the presentation will go most of the time. And that's probably due to just the facts that I've chosen to put into the story, and how I've, I guess, relayed those facts about the individuals involved. So a bit of a long-winded kind of response to that one, but that's probably just the gist of how I feel, and that kind of reflects my role a little bit, I think. Okay, next up we have a question from Luke. And the question is, how long does it take, typically, to produce an episode of the podcast? Like from start to finish, research, writing and recording, etc. I guess similar to the structuring of the episodes, each case is different and each presentation can vary in length. And so I guess it depends on the case. It depends on how much information is known. It depends on how much information is available at the time. And it just depends on how the story seems to flow and how I interact with that story. Sometimes it may be a really quick process, and maybe just I could be in the zone and the research is there. The story really flows. I've got a real clear direction of how I want it to unfold, and it'll be done, say, potentially start to finish, including the research, the writing and recording, potentially around 6 hours. But then on the other end of that spectrum, if the case is a bit more in depth, if there's lesser information available or readily available, then potentially that process will be a longer process. And so that could range, maybe it could take about potentially 6 hours to collate that research, to structure in a way that I feel suits the story and how it needs to unfold. And then it could potentially be another even 6 hours to get it down. And again, to look at the sound bites that I need to use, to look at any kind of effects or soundscapes that I need to source or record potentially or compose. And so depending on, I guess, my engagement with the story, with the actual potentially the composition, the music composition side of it, it can take a bit longer. So long story short, probably it can range from about 6 hours to a quicker one right through to 12 hours potentially, or even slightly longer, give or take. Okay, next question we have from Sonia. And the question is, are there a lot of expenditures involved in podcasting? Broadcasting fees, licenses, apps to download, etc. I'm pretty lucky in that I've done a fair bit of recording prior to podcasting, in the shape of recording bands or music, and so I've been pretty well set up with equipment and with the software. Now there's always room for improvement as far as the gear that podcasters use. So I think I will be looking to upgrade it and just to try and step it up a notch as far as sound quality and as far as the equipment and apps that I'm using. But initially for me, I guess it's just the main thing is the time that's injected into it. That's probably the main expense. But as far as the initial setup costs, I think initially before I made the switch to Audio Boom as a host, there were fees in the form of using SoundCloud as a host. And that initially that wasn't a problem, in that I kind of, when I got set up, I only had a few episodes uploaded. But when it got to the point where it maxed out the upload capacity for SoundCloud, I then went into I upgraded to a subscription to SoundCloud, and so there were costs involved with that. But then when I was picked up by Audio Boom, those costs were done away with, and they basically host my podcast for free, and with that comes the opportunity for advertising as well. So I guess anyone who's looking to start a podcast, anyone who has an idea for a podcast, all you really need is a microphone of a decent quality and some recording software, and then just general editing skills will get you by. And so yeah, but I think from my point of view, I'm looking to upgrade my equipment a little bit, so there will potentially be costs associated with that, depending on the I guess the level of quality you want to achieve with your podcast. Okay, next up we have a question from Karen, and that question is, do you have any plans to create a Patreon account? And I guess that question kind of links back to the previous one, in that at some point, as I mentioned, I'll be looking to upgrade my equipment and to kind of step it up a notch as far as the quality of the presentation that I'm delivering. But I really want to make sure that before I launch the Patreon account, I've kind of worked out the added value that will come with that. And so I really want to make it worth the while of listeners who are parting with their hard-earned cash, to make it a added bonus that is actually worth that bonus. Okay, so I'm still in the process of kind of working through that, and again, I really want to make sure that it's valuable content that will make it worthwhile to the Patreon supporters. So as yet, I haven't got a Patreon set up, but I do have plans, and at the moment it's just to be confirmed. There's nothing set in stone, but I really want to make sure that it's set up right, it's the right content, and that it's worth the while of those who are investing their precious hard-earned money. Okay, next one is from Karen, another Karen. And so the question is, how does your family handle all the talk / interest of true crime? And I guess this is something I've kept fairly separate from my family and friends. It's only really recently that I've actually started to share that I do a podcast with my friends. And so in some ways that was based around being a little bit self-conscious about it. Also, it's probably based around I wanted to really kind of make sure that the podcast launched on its own right, rather than trying to kind of tap into the support network of families and friends. And so I really wanted it to kind of be successful in its own right, and not kind of look for too much support from my immediate circle of family and friends. But my wife is not super keen on true crime. She's supportive of my venture and my involvement in the podcast, and is really supportive of, I guess, the success that it has seen. But at the same time, she's not super keen to hear about the various cases. There's been times when I've just trialed out parts of the script on her, and a lot of the times she will not be keen to hear too much of that, and it's something that she doesn't really enjoy, as far as the I guess the dark nature of a lot of the cases that are covered. And so she kind of keeps it fairly separate, and it's not something that I discuss a lot. There may be cases that are happening on the news, or things that I find interesting that we'll talk about, but anything that gets a little bit dark or a bit grim, she's not too keen to discuss. Yeah, so I guess it's kept fairly separate from my social circle, and so I found that I really enjoy the feedback that I get from the online podcast community, and that's probably the main drive for continuing and for just tapping into that support as far as the online groups that are involved, whether it's my own Felon discussion page, or whether it's the podcasts we listen to page, or whether it's the Minds of Madness discussion page. They've been really, really supportive. And in speaking of that, we have the two Karens from that page as well. So the last two questions have come from two people who are really involved in that page. So so that's the main interaction I have about true crime and true crime podcasts and different stories that are occurring. My main interaction is really kind of online in that community rather than my immediate family or friends. Next up, we have a question from a fellow Aussie, Xavier. And so his question is, how did your fascination with true crime start? Was there a particular case or moment in time? And that is a question that I've kind of, since receiving that is one I've reflected on, and I can't really pinpoint one particular moment in time. I remember in high school that there were a number of high profile cases that popped up that I found really kind of affected my mindset and opinion of, I guess, how humans interact with each other, and how that there is a lot of bad, and there is a lot of kind of things that happen in the world that is quite dark. And so I guess through high school I really enjoyed a lot of different forensic crime shows, whether it was fictional or factual. There's a range of different Australian and international ones that I really watched. So I think there's always been some sort of interest, but I can't pick a defining moment. I know that the case that I've covered fairly recently, that involved the Van Crevel family, that was a case that really stood out to me in high school, and just the brutal nature of the crimes themselves. And that was something that I, in reflecting on actually doing the case in the presentations, that was something that I remembered kind of standing out to me. And so I guess along the way there's been a range of different cases that have stood out. I think also my interest in kind of things that are a little bit grim and a little bit darker stemmed from, I remember in primary school we used to have a book club, or there'd be book orders where you'd receive a sheet and you can order books. You tick off the book that you want, you put your money in the envelope, and then you receive your book. And there was always this excitement about the new books that you received. And I remember probably in grade 5 or grade 6 that I ordered, and it was a collection of poems by Edgar Allan Poe. And so that was something that I think kind of stood out to me as far as really tapping into the imagery of how words can create an image in your mind, and the image that was created by those poems, and in particular the Telltale Heart, was something that really stood out to me, and it really kind of opened my mind to, I guess, the power of words, and how that they can be used to convey a story, but then also not just the story itself, but also how they can convey feelings and emotions, and how they can create a picture in your mind that really can affect you in some way. Okay, so I guess that's not based in fact, but that was based in kind of like the fictional portrayal of crime, and that's something that stuck with me as well. Okay, next up we have a question from Tara Saraban, and if you listen to Bloody Murder, the podcast Bloody Murder, you will know of Tara. And her question is, do you only cover murders on the podcast that you secretly committed yourself? Okay, so if you're familiar with Bloody Murder, you know their kind of their comical take on the true crime genre. And so this is, I guess, based on a running joke, I guess, we've had as far as the podcast being a cover for my criminal activities. But the answer to that is that not all of them, just some of them. I'm going to leave it at that. Okay, this comes from fellow Aussie Christy, and if you listen to Canadian True Crime or Canadian True Crime podcast, you'll be familiar with Christy. And her question is, what's been your favourite episode and your least favourite? This is probably something I should have given a little bit of thought to. I guess the episodes, you kind of can compare them to children. It's hard to have a favourite. But there's ones that potentially may have different effects on you. So I think one that really kind of stuck with me, and just because of the nature of the crime, and just because of how brutal it was, and how it was something that affected someone so young, and someone so young was the victim of it. I think the case of Carly Ryan really stands out to me, just because it's really kind of bleak and a really kind of grim end to someone's life who was so young and who had so much of potential and so much of their life ahead of them. So that's one that's, I think, has affected me as far as the research, and there was quite a bit of detail in the court documents, and so that I think was something that's, I wouldn't say it was a favourite case. I wouldn't say it's my least favourite, but it's one that has affected me greatly. But I think also just to see that there has been positive that has come out of that, and that Carly's mum has really kind of, I guess, overcome the dark days of what occurred, and that's really driven her to set up a foundation that does a lot of work for, I guess, the spreading the awareness to young people as far as the need for being cyber safe, and it does share a lot of the risks associated with talking to people online that they may not know who that person is, and so to see that something so dark and so bleak has driven something that's become so positive, I think that's again it's a that kind of helped me to kind of get past how shocking the details of that case were. So just to see that her mum came out the other end and that she's using it as a force for good, that's been really inspiring. So probably really doesn't answer the question as far as my favourite or least favourite, but that's kind of my reflections on a case that's affected me, I guess, for the good and for the bad. Okay, so we have a question now from Adam, and again the question is, any plans for a Patreon page? And so I have touched on that. He then goes on to say, I know your life must be busy, super busy to create extra content, but I'm sure many listeners would be happy to support the show. There have been I've been fairly surprised with the amount of listeners that have been in touch and who have asked about a Patreon page. And so I guess I have touched on that question before, but because there has been interest, it is something I'm definitely looking at, seriously looking at, but it's kind of based around that extra content being worthwhile, of being extra paid content. So that's really what that's based on. Okay, next up, we have 2 more questions from Tara, and the first one is, are you now / were, are you now / were you ever a member of TISM? Now, those unfamiliar with the band TISM, that's TISM. The group TISM were a band, an Australian band that kept their identities a mystery, and they wrote a lot of kind of tongue-in-cheek, humorous songs. So the answer is that I'm not now in the band TISM, and I haven't been in the band TISM, but I would like to extend my interest to the band TISM, that if they're ever looking for a mediocre guitarist, then I'd be happy to fill that position. So here's the open throwing my hat in the ring to potentially, if they're looking to reform, I'll be honoured to be a member of TISM. And also, we have another question from Tara, and this relates to her co-host of Bloody Murder, Barney. And the question is, do you know how many jelly beans Barney Black can fit in his wide, gaping mouth? Now, the fact that Tara has asked the question seems to be, that it's probably the case that Barney can fit a lot in his wide, gaping mouth. And so I would like to run a competition, a guessing competition, and open this up to Felon listeners, to Bloody Murder listeners, to anyone who is in contact on the Felon page or Bloody Murder page. I would like to open up a competition, and I would personally supply the jelly beans if we attempt to see how many jelly beans fit into Barney Black's mouth. And I'm sure we could come up with some sort of prize for the listener who can guess the right amount for that. So here's an invitation to Barney and to Tara to let's make this competition happen. Let's see how many jelly beans can fit into Barney's wide, gaping mouth. Okay, next up, we have 2 questions from Lauren. The first one is, how do you choose the cases you cover? And I think that varies. Sometimes it's a case that I've been thinking about for a while. Sometimes it's a case that's just popped up and I've come across in my online searches for other cases. And so it does vary, but typically, again, getting back to how I like to unfold those stories, typically it'll be a story that has some sort of twist, or that has some sort of hook that I feel would be interesting to a listener. And again, I put myself in the shoes of the listener and think, if this would be a case that I'd like to hear, then potentially it's a case that someone else would like to hear. And so that's the main way I choose cases, and cases that are interesting to me are typically the ones that I would choose to cover. The second question we have from Lauren is, are you and Cambo Ford related, since you both hide your identity? As far as I know, we are not related, so if you're familiar with True Crime Island and the host Cambo Ford, he has been known to hide his identity as well. And potentially, it's a pretty small place, Australia, so potentially we could be related. I haven't really looked into the genealogy of it, but I'm not ruling it out at this point. So we'll look into it and keep you posted. Next up, we have a few questions from Danielle. And the first one is, how do you find the time to do all of this? Do podcasters sleep? So it is At times it can be a stressful venture, and it can be a tiring venture to have a podcast. And I'm sure that the many podcasters could attest to this as well. And I guess it's all based around kind of being organized and structuring times, and I guess allowing yourself a window of time to fit this in. I'm typically not a super organized person, and so I've had to learn to be a bit more structured, a bit more organized with my time, and that's sometimes it's worked, sometimes I've had a deadline and it's required an all-nighter, and that's to either write the script and then to record, or potentially it's taken a long time to record, and it requires an all-night recording session, and then after that session I'll then head off to work. And that's been rare, but it has happened, and it's not an ideal situation it's not a very sustainable thing to be doing. And so again, it just gets back to being structured, being organized, and making sure that there's time allocated to get it in. But sometimes with deadlines, it can get a little bit stressful, a little bit rushed. So there's been times when I've got to the point where it's been a need to record one word at a time, because towards the end of a recording session, it's just been kind of fairly slurred kind of words that are coming out, and it's not good. It doesn't really doesn't really do too much for, I guess, your mental well-being, but it's also puts you under a little bit of stress as far as getting it out and getting it finished. And so that probably ties into the next question as well. And Danielle goes on to ask, how do you balance research, recording, editing, etc. with real life? And so potentially if I have the script written, if I have it recorded, sometimes I'm able to edit that. I can edit that at my work during lunch break, and so sometimes it means kind of multitasking at times as well. So so that's probably the main thing as far as the balance. I guess research occurs when I have time. Recording needs to happen within a certain window of time. I need to be at home. Be difficult in some cases. There may be the weather could affect whether I'm able to record or not. There could be rain. We have a tin roof, and my room is a top story, the top floor. So the rain on the tin roof can affect recording. Outdoor noise can affect that. So there's a range of different factors that can affect that. The next question is, do you have a pet? And I do have a pet. And speaking of my pet, I've got a little surprise for you here. And she's just fallen asleep here, but I'll see if I can wake her up. Come on, Queenie. This is my pet, Queenie. She's a little bit tired at the moment, having a nap. But she's an English Staffy, and she likes cuddles. So say hi, Queenie. Good girl. Sit. And she'll go back to sleep. Good girl. The next question is, have you met any other podcasters in real life? If so, who and under what circumstances? As of yet, I've met the hosts of Dead and Buried, a really good podcast from Melbourne, and so they actually ran a session at the Coburg Library that I attended, and that was really interesting as far as the process they go through to create their podcast, the amount of research that went into their presentations, and just a really good view of the behind the scenes that went into that particular podcast. So I would really highly recommend checking out Dead and Buried. It's well worth checking out, and yeah, they're really super nice, really nice people. So check them out. But yeah, they're the only podcasts that I've met in real life. But hoping to do some meetups and hopefully do some collaborations in the near future. So watch this space, and we'll keep you posted on that. Next up, we have a question from Jess, and the question is, how long does it take to research each case? And again, I've probably answered this in a previous question, but it does vary. The research based on what is readily available, whether I need to look through archives of old newspaper articles, whether there's court documents that are easily accessible, but yeah, it can take a range. So typically, probably, if I had to put a figure on it, probably about maybe 3 hours, give or take, on research, and then it's structuring it and putting it into a script that makes it flow, makes it coherent to the listener. Okay, we have a question from Kate. And we have, are there any type of crimes that hit you to the core, that you struggle to get your head around? And how did you get into podcasting? Is there a defining moment that kicked off your interest in true crime? I guess the main types of crimes that really do affect me as an individual would be ones that involve children, and typically, specifically when children are the victim in those cases. And those cases that have been covered when young people have been affected and young people have been the victims in really horrific or brutal crimes, I would say those are the ones that do seem to linger the most and that would have the longest lasting effects as far as how much they do impact personally, as far as the research and the knowledge of those crimes. And just, again, as the question says, how do you, anything that kind of makes you struggle to get your head around, those are ones and specifically those who are harmed by those who are close to them and in either a relative or a position of trust. Those are the ones that I really struggle to get my head around, is that especially being a father and reading cases or hearing stories that someone who is supposed to be the main provider of care and to be the main provider of support and love, for that person to be someone that harms someone that's close to them, that's a really, really tough one to get your head around. And I'm sure a majority of listeners would feel the same about that. The second question, how did you get into podcasting? Is there a defining moment that kicked off your interest in true crime? As far as getting into podcasting, I used to listen quite a bit to Hamish and Andy. Now, that's more of a comedy podcast, but that really opened my eyes to the world of podcasts, and I then kind of moved on to Ricky Gervais and his podcast that was based around his interactions with Carl Pilkington. And then I started to get into This American Life, Criminal, Serial, and then from there, as I started to listen to a range of different stories, I started to look at the stories that I felt would be interesting in podcast form, and stories that were Australian stories, and they kind of shared our narrative a little bit. And so the very first episode I produced was based around a story or a case that occurred just around the corner from my old residence. So I was living in Glenroy at the time in Victoria, so so it's a northern suburb of Melbourne, and the case of the Crawford family came up, and I read some things online, and I read the book Almost Perfect, and that really gave an in-depth look at the case, and it really opened my eyes to the type of stories that we had kind kind of, I guess, at our disposal as far as sharing that to a wider audience. So that kind of kicked it off for me. I didn't jump in straight away. I kind of thought about it for a little bit. I planned that episode, and I guess looking at I really took my time to see what was, I guess, available as far as podcasts that existed already in Australia, and so that was kind of, that guided the choice to make Felon specifically based around Australian stories, because I felt we do have a range of different true crime cases that are fairly uniquely Australian, and I felt that there was a niche for that. So that kind of guided my interest in getting into podcasting. I didn't really think about episodes beyond the first one, and I wish I had at the time, because I kind of dropped the first one on SoundCloud. There seemed to be a bit of interest, and based on that interest, it kind of guided me to do another episode. But I wish, in hindsight, that I had really kind of had a few episodes ready to go before launching, because it was really kind of, once it got up and running, it felt like I was chasing my tail a little bit. So, but that's kind of how it began, and I guess the rest is history. And so it's become a little bit more structured since then. And I've kind of got into a bit more of a momentum. There have been times when I've taken breaks from it based on personal circumstances, but hopefully I can keep up that momentum and just really kind of see how far it can go. And again, the final question was, is there a defining moment that kicked off your interest in true crime? There wasn't really a defining moment. Again, I kind of touched on that earlier, that just looking at a range of different true crime stories that popped up when I was younger, that really kind of drew me into to kind of see that's, even though it is dark and even though it is quite grim to look at, that is part of, I guess that's part of life in general, that there is that side, and there's no way we can really ignore those things that happen. So I wouldn't say that the true crime is necessarily, I wouldn't classify it as an enjoyment type thing, but it is an interest, and it's something that I've kind of I guess I've had since I was quite young. Next question we have, this is from Renee, and the question is, when is Felon After Dark being released? So Felon After Dark is a side project that has been a bit of an in-joke for some listeners, but I would say just watch the space and we'll see. So look out for Felon After Dark. Okay, we also have a serious question from Renee, and the question is it hard not to take criticism personally? Was it hard to take that first step of putting yourself out there? I think putting myself out there was a fairly easy process, I found. And when I recorded the presentation, or the very first episode, I kind of recorded it for myself initially, and I recorded in a way that I felt the story could be presented in an interesting way, in a way that allowed a bit of suspense, a bit of intrigue. And it was more about just going through the process to see if I could make a podcast. And so putting it out there was fairly straightforward as well, in that I have been fairly familiar with SoundCloud. I have played in a range of different bands, and so I uploaded music before, and so it was just basically the same process as that. Going through the process of registering on iTunes was a little bit more complicated, but I guess just deciding to put myself out there didn't feel like a big step, because I didn't really feel like a lot of people would potentially listen to it in the first place. So I didn't really think beyond, I guess, just putting it online and putting it out there. And so it was a bit of a surprise when it did start to get a few listens, and it wasn't massive massive kind of downloads, but it was more than I expected, to be honest. So the first question, part of that question was, is it hard not to take criticism personally? So I guess that was the tough part as far as reading through iTunes reviews, in that when the podcast first started, I found that the podcasting community and the podcasting listening community were really supportive especially on the page of the group podcasts we listen to. And so a lot of it came back as really, really good feedback and really supportive feedback. But as soon as it becomes available on a worldwide platform, I guess that's when it becomes available for outsider criticism. And admittedly, it was pretty tough to kind of take the first few negative reviews that I started to receive. And since then, there's been the more listeners you get, the more positive feedback you get, but also the more negative feedback you get as well. So I guess for me, it's a bittersweet kind of situation, in that for me to be able to get negative feedback, it means that it's on a platform that's generating quite a few listens, and so that's a positive. But I guess it doesn't really become easier. I guess you do develop a bit more of a tough skin to the negative feedback. But I think also it is important to take on board that negative feedback as well, because that's how you can grow, that's how you can progress, and that's how you can make a better presentation. So, long story short, it was initially hard to take that criticism, but I think it just comes down to kind of separating yourself from the podcast. There's always going to be negative people. There's always going to be people who put down any creative kind of ventures or any creative projects, and that's just going to happen. So I've learned not to take it as personal. It's not a personal attack on me. I'm still the same person, but there is, and the nature of it, that people are going to have their tastes, people are going to have their preferences, and it's not going to always be in line with the podcast that you have, or and that's across the board. That could be musical tastes as well. They're not always going to like the band that you're playing, or they're not always going to like the books that someone may write. So I think it's natural to have critics, and I've learnt to kind of take on board the constructive criticism. Hopefully it's shaped the podcast in a way that's making it better. But I think it's just part of it. There's always going to be that negativity, and just need to roll with it. Okay, so this one is from Twitter. We have a question from Galpo. So shout out to Galpo. He's been in touch quite a bit. Actually, Galpo78 is his Twitter handle. And the question is, how and why did you decide to start a podcast on Aussie crime? So I've touched on this a little bit, but I think specifically why I decided to focus on Aussie crime was that in my, I guess, listening to podcasts, there wasn't a podcast that I felt kind of just focused on just Australian crimes, and so that was a guiding force for me to kind of think that could be a niche for a potential podcast. Now, obviously, there are a range of different podcasts that are based in Australia now, but yeah, I really felt that there's a range of different Aussie cases that could be covered, and there's no shortage of crime in Australia, and there's no shortage of true crime stories. So I felt that it's that I'd kind of stay within my own backyard for the time being and share those stories. This next one is from Twitter as well. It's from Jared, and the question is, what is the best true crime show on telly? Forensic Investigators, the one with Lisa McCune, is the best. IMHO, sorry. Um, I think that would be one of my favorites. I think as far as how straight up the stories are told. It's a really good breakdown of facts. There's not a lot of creative license in the recreations of scenarios, and so I would say that would be, as far as the ones I've seen, Forensic Investigators would be one that really is a standout for me for sure. Just because, like I said, it's really factual. They talk to investigators, they talk to people who have been involved in the forensic side of things, and so that's, I think you're onto a winner there, Jared, for sure. Okay, this one is from Instagram, and this is from Back Beyond Above. And the question is, why did you start the podcast? How long does it take you to record and produce a whole episode? Thanks, a fan in Ireland. Okay, so it's good to know that Felon has made it to Ireland. I think I've probably touched on these questions previously, so hopefully I think I've answered that question or those questions. But yeah, it does vary from case to case. But yeah, like I said, typically it could be from 6 hours through to 12 hours. But yeah, shout out to all the listeners in Ireland. Thanks for getting in touch. Okay, another one from Instagram, and this is from Nay Willow. And this one is, can you show us your face? Dying to put a face to the name. Okay, so this is like I said, this would be I think in my reply to this, I think it would be a very underwhelming part of this AMA. And so for the time being, I'll be keeping my identity under wraps. But yeah, I appreciate that there's people trying to put or wanting to put a face to the name, to the voice. Okay, so I've got a range of questions from Instagram user Your Mate Rach, and the first one is, how hard is it to source all the information needed to create an episode? I have touched on this a little bit earlier. It can vary depending on if there's court documents that are readily available, depending on if there is, I guess, a range of different reliable sources in the form of either online media, digital media, newspaper articles. It can vary. So depending on how high profile the case is, that will affect how readily available that information is. The next question is, when did you first get into true crime? Now, I've touched on that earlier. I'm pretty sure I've covered that a couple of times, so I won't go too much into that one. The next question is, what's the hardest part about creating a podcast? I think one of the hardest things I've found is that I guess structuring it in a way that you can release ongoing material and it doesn't get too much on top of you as far as the workload. So I think that's the very main thing. Another thing is just the choosing of stories to cover. In that sometimes I'm torn as far as what will make a good episode, or and sometimes it's hard to know until you start writing the script if that is going to be I guess an effective story or an engaging story. So that's probably the two main things would be kind of just allocating the time you need to do the story justice, but also the selection of stories as well, as far as picking a story and running with it, and then I guess following it through to the point that it does make an engaging presentation. The next question is, why is true crime so interesting to you? Now, I guess I've touched on this a little bit, but I think I find it interesting because it's something that we, in our everyday lives, we're fairly well sheltered and protected from. And it's something that until you're faced with a scenario that really kind of either affects yourself personally, in the form of, I guess, being the victim of crime, or if you're faced with potentially a family member or a friend who is the victim of a crime. It's something that we kind of go about our daily lives without a lot of thought to. And I guess with if you watch the news or read newspapers, it can be in the forefront, but it always seems to be stories that happen to someone else, and it's not something that we kind of think personally is going to happen to us. And even though we can be emotionally affected by someone else's story, or someone else being the victim of a particular crime, and especially a crime that's violent in nature. And so I find it interesting because it is that other side of life, in that it's dark, it's gloomy, it's grim, it's messy, but it's just as much part of our lives as the happy times as well. And it's something that we don't necessarily need to dwell on, but I think it's good to be aware of, and it's good to kind of, I guess, have in the back of your mind, just to kind of stay aware in certain situations, and to make sure that I guess you do all that you can to potentially avoid those situations. So that's why I find it personally interesting. Now that could vary from listener to listener, but there's obviously something that I guess the true crime kind of evokes in us, that keeps us coming back and to listen to true crime in the form of podcasts, or to view documentaries, or in a range of different types of media. So I think there's definitely something that keeps us coming back. And so that's probably something I'd like to hear from listeners as well. What is it about true crime that keeps you interested? Why are you interested in true crime? So if you can get in touch through Facebook, through Twitter, through Instagram, let me know why you find true crime interesting, and we'll see what types of responses we get back from that. And the next one is, where do you begin when you research a new case? I try and structure it in a way that when I'm looking at if there's a reveal or if there's a twist, I try and look at when that's going to occur, and I guess I plot as far as how I want the story to unravel, but then I also plot in where it's going to as well, so how it's all going to wrap up, what's the conclusion, how is everything resolved, if it's resolved at all, and what potentially could be the most intriguing way to start to open up that story. So I guess I try and start off with a bit of a hook and a bit of an intriguing kind of situation. Usually there could be some sort of, like I said, a twist, and then it's mapped out in a way that allows you to progress from that initial hook right through to the end, where everything's wrapped up the best it can be based on the case. Okay, another one from Instagram, and user mfogel01 says, fan in America, what is the hardest case emotionally, mentally that you've had to cover? Again, I'll probably touch on this, but I think anything that involves young people, anything that involves children being the victims of violent crimes, those are the ones that I think affect me the most emotionally, mentally, beyond recording and beyond releasing that episode. Those are the ones that kind of stick with you a little bit. So definitely, the ones involving children. Okay, just scrolling through the rest of those questions, and that brings us to the end. So that's the end of the very first AMA for Felon True Crime. So hopefully that's shed a little bit of light onto the podcast. hopefully you've seen a little bit into the background of how I operate and how the podcast came to be. It was probably a little bit longer than I expected it to be, so thank you for all the questions. Hopefully if you stuck around for all that, it was a bit of a long slog actually, so hopefully it wasn't too boring for you. But if you have stayed to the end, thanks for watching, thanks for getting in touch, thanks for listening. Really do appreciate the support that I have received for the podcast. It's gained so much more support and so many more listens than I had anticipated. So I just want to say thank you for everyone who has listened, who's been in touch, who's given your feedback, who's rated, who's reviewed, all the podcasters who've been supportive. Really do appreciate the work that does go into podcasts, and doing my own has really shaped my opinion on how I view that. So thank you to everyone. I hope you've enjoyed it, and I'll be in touch online. So hopefully we'll get another or a second AMA at some point. Thanks for listening, and I'll see you all next time.